Good morning, Jamie. Welcome to a Cladding Matters.
Gareth's voice has just disappeared. We'll perhaps continue. Gareth is in transit. He's on his way to Shaftesbury's Fringe, where his band is playing both this evening and tomorrow evening. There's headliners
I
there.
have returned. I've returned. Bienvenue. Welcome once again to Cladding Matters. Of course, as per usual, we are joined by Steve, Day. Hang on a moment. Let me just sort this out so I can see everybody. Wonderful. I can see everyone. Hamish for Claire. Of course, when it's thank you very much for spending your time with us. And as is traditional, I'm going to ask Hamish to start us off.
Right. What we sort of felt that there are changes weekly. In fact, probably I was speaking to one of my colleagues who spends an awful lot of time in the House of Commons, the House of Parliament sort of generally. And he said it is absolutely stunning how many occasions the topic of property is brought up, because it's such a fundamental part of what this particular government is trying to keep moving. And again, hands up to them. It's something we certainly needs to happen. However, not all steps are necessarily positive. As we actually found out, the Building Safety Act in itself causes many problems that it solved. And in actual fact, to a certain extent, is endangering the lives of people still, instead of actually sort of securing their safety. Now, what's actually so happened just particularly recently, the Building Safety Regulator, which came under the auspices of the Health and Safety Executive, I think they were called, has been transferred. So no longer are they independent. They've actually been taken over by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, whatever, MCLHG, I think they call it, which really has removed the independence and to put a fire inspector in. And one of the challenges is what you really need there is somebody who has a broad experience of properties, just somebody who is actually accustomed to a fire shaft or the fire precautions on their own. They don't necessarily know what the regulations are relative to all of the items which the Building Safety Regulator should be aware of.
Well, look, I think at this point I need to pass over to Wendy. This is obviously ridiculous and restrictive, specifically for existing purchasers, but also for first-time buyers.
It's really, well, I can't imagine how, because of how complicated all of this is, that first-time buyers would actually really have a full understanding on what the implications are. So it makes it really difficult for them to know whether buying a flat, which is, as we all know, the most common type of a home that a first-time buyer does tend to buy, whether it's going to be safe for them to live in or not. So it is really confusing, I think, for first-time buyers.
Wow. Steve, what's your take on this? I mean, as a person who has been locked into his residence at Royal Artillery Quays because of all this nonsense, you must have a pretty sharp-edged view.
Well, I mean, so firstly, as we're talking about the Building Safety Regulator, let's give you an insight. So, as you know, at Royal Artillery Quays, the Building Safety Regulator is our lead regulator, because our buildings are above 18 meters, which is their sort of current remit. And we made technical arguments to the Building Safety Regulator to stop them basically restuffing panels instead of replacing them. So they wanted to hack out the combustible insulation and then stuff in a load of non-combustible. But there was no guarantee that a 20-year-old panel would be able to cope with that and not let in water and damp and everything. And these are sealed panels, you know. Anyway, the Building Safety Regulator overrode Barrett's PAS 9980 fire risk assessment plan and ruled in our favour. So, you know, but unfortunately they didn't on the fire shafts with the panels, the XPS panels. But they did a decent thing, at least by that decision. Now, in contrast, the fire brigade, we've managed to get 1 out of 8 enforcement notices from them, and then they gave an excuse that the other 7 shouldn't really be enforcement notices, even though they have the same defect of the missing fire doors. They downgraded them to be notices to deficiencies. And you know, the reason is because their inconsistencies, because they want to limit the liability, I believe. That's my view, but I believe that there's a liability limiting exercise, and if you extend that to PAS 9980, the building safety regulator is basically responsible for enforcing a flawed standard. So what can they do, really? They can't really say, oh, it's, you know, it's against the law to leave the panels on, even though it's against the building regulations for new buildings. Building safety regulators' hands are tied. So I would say that putting the fire brigade in charge of the building safety regulator with a walking down and subjective risk-based approach as enacted under the fire safety order, which is what they enforce and not the current building regulations, we're going to see more watering down. And PAS 9980 is being watered down right now. Let's not forget that. There's a public consultation that ended. And yeah, it's an appalling situation. And unless the building safety regulator enforces building regulations at the time of construction for existing remediations, we will see more and more of the same. And finally, let me just give you an update onto what's happened last night. So they slipped out a deadline to fix half the defects, so unsafe cladding rather than all the building defects. And they've said 80 meters need to be fixed by 2019, or landlords will face unlimited fines and imprisonment. So
unlimited fines
and imprisonment. A new remediation bill will stitch them up, basically. So we're looking at not only a watered down standard, but a government that's insistent on speeding up the substandard remediations under threat of prison. And this is the danger of a watered down remediation program, because you're effectively now threatening prison against anyone that calls it out and that doesn't remediate the buildings. And remember, this is only half the remediation, the external stuff, but the internal, which of course was 432 million in the case of the Olympic Park, is not being included in this, and for good reason, because they've excluded so many leaseholders, 1.7 million, from protection from all of those costs. So yeah, it's a mess, and it all comes back to what we've been arguing all along: reform the remediation standard, keep the standard the same for old as new buildings, and ensure all leaseholders are funded, and give the building safety regulator the teeth to enforce building regulations and not a flawed remediation standard. Because if you enforce nothing, you get nothing enforced.
Hamish, it seems to me that much as there's a lot of hoo-ha about enforcement, this thing has no teeth. And on top of it, it seems that we went from multiple enforcement notices and we drifted down to a single one. It doesn't feel like this is very genuine.
Well, this is one of the big challenges, that there's so much inconsistency as we're trying to move forward. And this is what we found within the program. If you recollect, we started this whole program speaking about cladding as a particular sort of topic. Now we're going to come back to this again sort of next week, because there are other people involved with them, if you like, they're campaigning relative to cladding. And one of the particular groups which wants to end all the cladding is trying to blame insurance companies for the content of unsafe materials. They're trying to say they're to blame for it, rather than the fact that they're allowed to be left in there. Because if somebody's going to insure your property, if it's unsafe to live in, it's unsafe to live in. So how the heck can you give the same standard of insurance to a property which is, if you like, safe, compared to one which is unsafe? There has to be a differentiation. Otherwise, you know, we could all drive around with sort of cars with sort of bare tires on and all the rest of it, and it wouldn't make any difference whether you looked after your vehicle or not and got an MOT. Do you know what I mean? The whole thing's absurd, because there's two-tier care, we call them, but it's two-tier standard within the way in which the government sort of seems to operate. And it must be absolute hell for anybody who wants to actually sort of try and buy into it. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I would feel if I was looking for somewhere to live, stuff it, I won't go anywhere near a flat. I would wipe out flats completely from if you like, when I looked at my shopping list. So quite how Wendy gets on in helping these people with the affordability there, because the staggering thing about it, and we know this for a fact, because this actually is one of the subjects which came up previously. In fact, I think it was yesterday, Wendy, which you might be able to remind me about, was flats dirt cheap because the management fees are horrendous.
Yes, Wendy, it seems like this is absolutely anathema to anybody who's looking for the first time, because historically, and this is going back tens of years, a first-time buyer will be looking at a flat, and that appears to be almost, but not quite, off the table. As Hamish said, they might be dirt cheap to buy, but once you're in there, you're crucified.
You know, the statistics are actually showing that more and more first-time buyers are beginning to leap over buying flats as their first home and moving straight into homes. And you can understand why. But there are certain parts of the country where it's really difficult for them to do so from an affordability point of view. London and the Southeast being a particular example of that.
Of course.
So people who want to live in and around London because that's where they work, they've almost got no choice but to consider looking at flats. But because of the fact that insurance costs have really skyrocketed, especially on buildings where there is an existing and probably will be an ongoing risk of cladding issues and fire risk for a really long time, it's making service charges skyrocket. So people need to actually look at not just how cheap a flat is and be fixated on the price of it. They need to be looking at what their ongoing costs are going to be to see whether they can actually afford to continue to live in that flat with skyrocketing service charges. I just wanted to go back onto a point that Steve mentioned about the fact that the government is bringing in a deadline to resolve a lot of these cladding matters. To be honest, I think in some respects that actually is good, because it should hopefully focus the mind of a lot of these developers to get the work done. It's quite, I mean, even this week, there's been a report in the press about courts dismissing an appeal by Get Living, who were trying to appeal the fact that they have an £18 million fire safety bill in relation to the Olympic Park. And what I've seen from my experience in the building industry, quite often what happens is parties point the blame at each other all the time, and they're constantly trying to pass the buck to make sure that it's not them who ends up being the one who has to foot the bill for the repair work or the remediation. So I'm really hoping that by having a deadline, it will stop all of this pass the parcel going on between the different parties and actually knuckle down and get something done, as long as it's not more corner cutting just to get the work done in the timescale that's required.
The problem is,
Can I just give you before you jump on? Both, I want your reaction to this. Spencer has just sent a comment, which I'm just going to add on the screen. You take a look at that and give me your reaction to it, please. First of all, Wendy, please.
Okay, well, just to read it very quickly, with the UK's new bill enshrining cladding remediation deadlines into law, how does the stricter statutory approach compare to a more flexible or fragmented global framework? Can private landowners, particularly mixed tenure, expected to comply without coercion? I really don't think that landowners and developers are inclined to actually complete and make sure the work gets done without having fines and legislation and enforcement of legislation kicking them up the derriere to actually do the work. So that would be my instant response to what Spencer has said.
And can I have your instant response as well, Steve?
well, the point is the standard for remediation is watered down, so speeding it up is just speeding up partial remediations. I mean, we're going to be condemned to permanently high insurance because this so-called cladding remediation we're having is leaving half of the cladding on the fire shafts. Literally every fire shaft has got flammable cladding left on. So for me, it makes absolutely no sense for them to tick a box and speed up partial cladding. You know, this is about getting the work done as fast as possible to move on and leave the liability with me, you know, with a £7,000 a year service charge due to insurance. And I am not happy that they're going to push this through.
Absolutely not.
And, you know, we can't just have this ending in 2029 with all the liability left on the homeowners. And that's what the government are trying to do here. And I'm afraid even the cladding groups are putting out this message. So just today, End Our Cladding Scandal blamed the insurance industry for the fact they're pricing in the risk of leaving the flammable cladding on. There's no mention of the water down standard. There's no mention of the fact that it's being partial remediations are being sped up, not full remediations. And it's a complete political cover-up, and it is disgusting. And we can't have a deadline imposed, because what that means is that we are going to be left with the bill. And I can't stress that enough. At 2029, everyone's going to say, isn't that great news? They pushed everyone in. We're going to be left with the bill for all of those flammable panels that we've got on our building, all the combustible XPS material that's staying on. And that's why I can't welcome it until this standard is, you know, improved. I mean, why can't we be left with the bill after the remediation is done?
As ever, it's great to have experts in the building. Hamish, would you care to take us home?
I think we're in one of those situations this week where it's very, very difficult. We've had sort of 2 or 3 items come up during the course of this week, which reinforces what I was saying about how often the subject of property is mentioned. And of course, coming back to this sort of the cladding issue just keeps coming. It is not going away. But we've also got this other aspect, is that councils who themselves could be acting on behalf of their residents choose, like they've done particularly within Greenwich Council, for example, they have basically turned around and saying it was perfectly all right at the time the place was built, even though their own internal regulators, if you like, those responsible in building control, said, hey, look, this fire shaft is wrong. They ain't got any fire doors apart from anything else. As far as the council are concerned, they couldn't give a rip. This is what they're intimating. They don't feel as though they're going to be held for responsible, even though within the Grenfell, when we know relative to the Grenfell inquiry, one of the major aspects was the council didn't take notice of the residents. And we still wait a council member, I think, to actually go in and speak to the people within Royal Artillery Quays to see what is their genuine concern. That hasn't happened. And it's not happening with all of these other changes. And as we well know, if you say something, it doesn't mean it's going to actually sort of happen. What exactly are the government going to do about all of these people? Because they're going to force out the very, very important people. We spoke about this in construction at the earlier part of this week on Tuesday. They're going to be forcing out the small to medium size landlords who contribute so significantly to the housing within this country. They're going to leave. It'll be back in the hand of the corporates. And we know what the corporates do, because the corporates, like, as we know, Barratt's, the builders, they're nice big corporates. They can afford to hide things under the doors, if you like, and all over the place, so they don't have to pay or do anything to make the residents safe in the properties which they've built, which in this one would argue are not totally safe for people to live in.
I remember, Hamish,
Look, I think it's our time is pretty much up today. Have you got any last words, Steve, before we run off?
Just please remember that it's a partial cladding remediation by the deadline, and no deadline for the non-cladding remediation. Okay, that's the more expensive one. 432 million in the Olympic Park. Let's not forget that. internal walls like Croydon Cityscape. That cost Barratt tens of millions of pounds, and they had to put an extra provision in their accounts because of it. These internal defects, there's no deadline for those. They don't want to talk about those. They've excluded 1.7 million people from protection from these awful defects. They know that bill's far larger than the cladding bill, and it's far more prevalent because all the buildings around the country have internal walls. Not all of them, blocks of flats, that is, have cladding, but they all have internal partitions between flats. And this is the big one, and they do not want to cover this with a deadline. And for the cladding remediation, they don't want to tell you it's partial and that the liability for all of the non-cladding defects isn't covered, and the liability for all the remaining external cladding work is going to the homeowner after these remediations are done. It's all about speeding up deadlines, and it's disgusting. And the councils are helping them do it, as you've seen with me being threatened. I'm still under legal advice, so I can't talk about but it's got far worse. And I'm under a serious pressure for trying to get these flammable panels off our fire shafts. And it's disgusting. So please do not think this is good news, because it surely is not.
Well, it's a shame that, but on that bombshell we have to end. Thank you so much, Hamish McSay, our Lord and Master from Search Convey, who helped put this channel together in the first place. Wendy Gibson of the First Time Buyers Club, thank you so much for your time. And of course, Steve Day, locked in as he is in Royal Artillery Keys, but trying to push forward on the building safety org. Please do visit that and support. And to all of you out there, thank you so much for your continued support by watching the channel. It means the world to us, but more importantly, our channel is about education. If you know what's going on, knowledge is power. You can use your critical thinking to make decisions once you know the truth. Until next week, please keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and please try and look after that mental health. Until then, bye-bye.
There's a tale about some folks with hammers and some nails. They'll polish through the moon, but their word always fails.